Right then, let's get started building our whack-a-mole game, or whack-a-duck as I'm going to build. Of course, you can build your own version, but that's what I'm going to be doing. So first things first, I'm in the terminal. We're going to start this from literally the first line of code and then take it all the way to working game. So depending on how this goes, maybe in multiple videos, but we'll see how it goes as we go along. So first of all, let's navigate to where we want to put our game. Now I'm going to put this in our classwork folder. So cd dev. So cd into dev and then cd into classwork. There we go. Of course, you could put this in your projects folder if you would like. One thing I would say is only do that if you intend to come back and really kind of make this game your own afterwards. Otherwise, keep it in your classwork, keep it kind of away from public GitHub, and then you can always move it into your projects folder afterwards. It's not really a problem. Okay, so we're in our classwork folder. Let's just ls to see what's in here, just good habit. And then we will mkdir, and I'm just going to call this whack duck. You call it whatever you like. Okay, so then let's cd into whack-a-duck. And let's start making some files. We know that we're going to need some HTML, we're going to need some CSS, and we're going to need some JavaScript. So let's go ahead and touch an index.html. And we will also mkdir a scripts folder and a styles folder. And then we'll touch a scripts/app.js and also a styles/main.css. Okay, let's just ls to make sure that that's all happened. I'm not going to check in the scripts and styles just yet. We can do that in VS Code in just a moment. Okay, so let's do code space dot to open this in VS Code. Okay, let me just move this around and I will zoom in a little bit to make that easier for you to see. I may have to zoom out later just to fit more on screen, but we'll see how it goes. Okay, and in our scripts, we've got our app.js. In our styles, we've got our main.css. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to double click on all of these because we're probably going to be jumping around between the three of them quite a lot. And it means that they're just up here at the top of my screen. It's up to you whether you have them all open or not. What I'm also going to do, I know that I'm going to be jumping in and out of live server quite a lot, so I'm just going to go ahead and do that. I'm going to right click on my index.html and open with live server. Of course, that will probably end up on my second screen, and I will drag that over now. Wonderful. And obviously you can use Alt and Tab or Command and Tab to switch between these, but I'm going to do that kind of half screen thing that I do. Right then. So what's the first thing that we're going to need if we're making a website? Well, we're going to need some boilerplate HTML. So use good old Emmett. We'll put this in for us. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to change our title to Whack a Duck. There we go. And if I save this, let's just confirm on our live server. Yep, Whack a Duck is there up at the top. So there's a couple of things that we definitely will need to do regardless. We're going to need to link up our CSS and our JavaScript. So first things first, let's go link. And then scroll down to CSS. And we just need to edit this path to our href here. So we're going to say it's in styles/main.css. And second of all, let's go ahead and add a script tag, but script source. And then this is in scripts/app.js. Fantastic. First thing that we're going to need to do, if we go and have a look at our kind of example grid game here, we can deal with the start whacking button and the score counting later. But one of the first things that we're going to need to do is create this grid. Now, this is 10 by 10 squares grid, so there's 100 squares here. And there's a couple of approaches that we can take here. We could make each one of them a div in HTML, but that would end up with a very long HTML file. And personally, I think that if you need to do something multiple times, you should probably use JavaScript to do it. If you need to do it once or twice, maybe 3 times, depending on the use case, you should probably do it manually in HTML. But if you need to do something repeatedly over and over, you should probably use JavaScript for that. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a grid div, and then inside it, we're going to put each of these cells or these kind of grid squares. So we need one grid wrapper, kind of one place to put our grid, and then also one place to put our grid. So we'll do that in HTML and then put each of the cells in JavaScript. And what doing this kind of two-step approach allows us to do is it means that we can interact with just the game grid itself if we want, and then we can also interact with kind of the wrapper for that game grid separately if we want to. So inside the body of our HTML, all we need to do is we need to put a div, and we'll give this a class of grid-wrapper. And then inside this, we're going to put the actual game grid itself. So we just need to put in another div, and we'll give this a class of, well, let's just call it the grid, I suppose. And this is empty for now. So if we just save that and then head over to our Wackaduck, you'll see that nothing has appeared. But if we just inspect and have a look in our body tags here, you'll see that the grid wrapper and the grid do exist. They're just not showing anything. There's nothing visible just yet. Well, what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to use some CSS to make those visible. Before we do that though, let's actually make our cells that go inside the grid. What this will mean is that when we start styling things up, we can actually kind of see this become a full game board. We can still make sure that our JavaScript is working by looking in the inspect tab, but it's good to have something actually on our page before we try to start styling it. Okay, so let's go ahead and enter our app.js. So we're going to be doing DOM manipulation. So what that means is we're going to need to have an init function and make sure that that runs only when the DOM content is loaded. So we'll say function init, add our parentheses and curly brackets. Now down here, we're going to say window.add event listener, DOM content loaded, and actually mine's already suggesting it here, but you may need to type this out. So it's DOM content loaded. Be very careful with your uppercasing of your letters. And then we want to run the init function as its callback. Excellent. So all of our code, all code here. So let's just make sure that our JavaScript is running first and foremost. So we'll say console.log JS is running and save that. Let's head over to our console and we get JS is running. Wonderful news. We now know that when we write some JavaScript, if we write it correctly, it is actually going to work on our website, on our web page. Fantastic. So what we want to do is we want to actually create a bunch of divs that will then be appended to our grid element in our HTML. Cool. Let's go ahead and do that. What I would recommend is actually writing this as a function. So inside our init function, I'm going to say function. And then what are we doing with this? Well, we're creating the grid. So let's call it create grid. Add our parentheses and some curly brackets. So what's this? Let's plan what we're doing here. So we want to, for every cell required, we want to create a div. And we want to append this div to our grid div. Oh, and I should definitely comment this out. So we want to append that cell div to our grid div. Let's do that then. So what we're going to need is definitely a for loop, and we'll have to loop 100 times to get our grid. So let's have a think about this. Are we going to want to change the size of our grid in the future? Well, possibly. So if there is a variable grid size, well, we should probably save that number in a variable somewhere. Now, we could give people the option to change the grid size maybe later on. Maybe we have kind of an easy where it's a 4x4 grid, a medium where it's a 6x6 grid, and then a hard, which is a 10x10 grid. So this is something that we're going to have to think about making variable. So up here above and outside of our function, I'm going to just make a variable, and we'll say const grid width, for example, equals, and we're going to say 10. Because what we want to do to begin with is a 10x10 grid. And what this will mean is that if we just change this variable to 6, we will hopefully, if we write our code flexibly enough, we will create a 6x6 grid. So how many cells are there in a square 10x10 grid? Well, there's 100. So it's going to be 10 across the top by 10 down the side. So what we can say is const num of cells, the number of cells, equals grid width multiplied by grid width. Of course, we could use the exponent operator there and say it's grid width to the power of 2 or it's grid width squared, but I think that this works quite nicely. This is quite obvious what this does. So let's just go ahead here and console.log out our num of cells. So when we double check this, yes, we get 100 cells. We're just checking that our sum here, our equation here is working. Okay, and I'm going to get rid of that. We know that that's working as we expect. So inside our create grid function, let's start writing our loop that's going to create these cells. So we'll say for, and then we'll need our parentheses, and we'll say let I equal 0, because we might as well start at 0. Semicolon. And then whilst I is less than our number of cells, num of cells, well, what do we want to do? We want to increment I. So we'll say I++. Okay, come out of here and start our code block for our for loop. So we say here, for every cell required, create a div. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. We could just create this div sort of anonymously, but we want to, I think it would be a good idea to have some things, especially whilst we're developing, we should maybe put the number of the div in each square so that if we're troubleshooting stuff, we can easily see in front of us kind of where the problem might be arising. So let's go ahead and make our cell a variable that we can do things to later in this for loop. So we'll say const cell, because don't forget, even though this is a constant variable, it's kind of the scope of just each for loop run, every time the for loop runs. So const cell equals, and we're going to say that this is a document dot create element. And what element do we want to create? Well, we want to create a div. So if we just save that now, has anything changed on in our code? No, we still get grid wrapper and we've still got our grid here. Well, that's because we're not actually putting it onto our document. Whilst we're creating those elements, they kind of still just live within JavaScript for now. We actually have to put that onto an element. So what I want to do is I want to say grid. I want to get our grid and then append this cell to it. So the first thing that we're going to have to do, and we're going to do this right at the top of our file, is we need to grab our grid element. So take a moment to think how we do that, but we're going to do it ourselves as well. So we will say const grid, because that's what it is, and it's good practice to kind of try and use our class names and our names that we've used in our HTML over here in our JavaScript, just keeps everything nice and easy to read later. And we'll set this equal to document.querySelector. And don't forget, you need to get your capitalization correct, but I'm using VS Code to help me with that. And then we will give it .grid. Okay, so if we save that now, what we should be able to do down here is append our cells to our grid. So let's go and do that. So we'll say grid dot append child, because we want to add children. We want these cells to be children of the grid. We want them to go inside that grid tag. So we're going to say grid dot append child. And then what do we want to put in there? Well, we want to put these cells in there. So we're going to say append this cell to our grid. So if we save that, let's have a look what's happened. Okay, still nothing visible, but if we go into our body and have a look at our grid wrapper and our grid, still nothing's happened. Let's just refresh the page to make sure that it's nothing odd happening. So why is that not happening? Have a look at this and have a pause for a moment and see if you can fix it. Okay, so let's have a look. We've written our function, but this is a very simple mistake, and it's something that catches me out, it catches everybody out. So we just didn't call our function. So down here, let's call our create grid function. So if we save that now, let's see what happens. Okay, so still nothing visible. But if we look inside our grid, we now have a bunch of divs. Now, I'm not going to go and count these, but I can absolutely guarantee that there will be 100 of them. Right, so now that we've got that cell here saved in a variable, we can do things to it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say our cell.inner text, and we're going to set this equal to I. So this will just literally put in there the number of whichever iteration we are on in that for loop. And what this will do is, I mean, it's not exactly styled very nicely at the moment, but what this does is it means that we can troubleshoot this really nice and easily. If something isn't happening correctly at number 10, then we can see in front of us that it is in cell number 10. Okay, I think this would be a good time because we've created all of our divs inside our grid. This would be a good time to start styling this actually into a grid. So we can do that with some CSS. And again, we could use JavaScript to put styles onto our cells and onto our grid. But I think doing this in a separate CSS file might be a slightly better approach because it's keeping our code dry, because we can select multiple elements in CSS. It's not like we have to write this out for every single cell. So let's head over to our CSS. Let's give our grid. Let's make this, I don't know, let's make it wide enough to have our squares be 60 pixels by 60 pixels. So one approach to doing this would be to say that our grid should be 600 wide. So we'll say width of 600 pixels. And also let's give it a height of 600 pixels. Of course, we could come back and make this responsive later on using percentages or view height, but for now, we're just getting the game working. So width and height of 600 pixels each. Now, let's get our cells. Now, of course, there's a couple of ways that we could do this. In our app.js here, what we could do is we could set the attribute of our cells to have a class of, say, cell. I don't think that's really necessary because we can use our knowledge of CSS selectors to get divs inside our grid. So we can literally just say here, our .grid divs, well, we want them to have some CSS properties. So in here, let's make our grid divs with a width of 60 pixels, 60 pixels, and a height of 60 pixels. Okay, let's go ahead and save that now, and let's have a look what's happened. Okay, so we've obviously added some sort of sizing, and actually if we use the selector and we kind of look at our divs, we can see that they are, in fact, 60 by 60. Let's make this a little bit easier to see. Let's give these a border of 1 pixel, solid, I don't know, grey. Let's just go with grey. Now, a fun thing here actually is we can use the CSS colors, but if you this is the English spelling of grey, but if you use the American spelling of grey, it's actually the same colour. So you can use whichever one you want. Obviously, I'm in the UK at the moment, so I'm going to use the E to spell grey. So let's save that. And yeah, we've got our borders here so that we can see where all of the grid lines are. Of course, we can remove these later in the final edit, but we're just developing for now, so we want to make it easy to see. Let's also put a border around our grid. So we'll say border of 1 pixel solid black and save that. Okay, so we can see that we've got a 600 by 600 grid here, but our cells are not kind of wrapping inside it. So the way that we can do that is we can use flex. We can use display flex to do this. So in our grid, let's just say display flex to make this into a flex box. Let's see what that has done. Okay, that's put them all on one line. That's not really what we wanted, but we're getting closer to what we actually want. Well, we want them to wrap in that box. So we'll say flex wrap is wrap. Okay, and save that. Ah, fantastic. We've actually started wrapping. But this is a bit weird. Why is this happening? So we get 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, but we don't wrap to number 9. Well, why is that? Well, if we just click on one of these and we remind ourselves of the box model, you'll see that the border is actually adding a little bit of size to this. So how am I going to overcome this? Well, we should probably make things really nice and responsive and have these all shrink and grow at exactly the right rates. I'm just going to cheat for now because this is mostly just here for development anyway. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drop down the width of these cell divs to 58 pixels each because we're adding a 1 pixel border onto each side of them, so we need to remove 2 pixels from them. Cool, so if we save that, you'll see that we now get that grid. It doesn't line up perfectly, but that's just due to the fact that it doesn't render out at exact pixels in the browser. That's fine though, for now, and if we wanted to keep these all as central as possible, we could in our grid here use justify content center. So we could say justify content and then put those center. So if we save that now, it kind of equals up our spacing on each side here. Okay, so we've got our grid of divs. That's fantastic. So what's the next thing that we need to do? Well, we need to be able to do something to these divs. We need to be able to add in our kind of little sprites every time that we want to, randomly select one and add a sprite in there. And we also want it to kind of pick up on clicks as well. So one of the easiest ways that we can make sure that we can always access each of our cells in our JavaScript is actually to have them as a kind of an array of elements. So up here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make an empty array, and then we'll push our cells to that array every time one is created. So we'll say const cells and set that just to an empty array. And then in our create grid function, what we're going to do is we're going to say cells so this array here, dot push, and then we're going to push our cell to that. So actually, let's just check that that's working. So underneath our create grid, where we're invoking our create grid function here, we'll say console.log cells. So if we save that now and head over to our console, you'll see that we've got this array that that is full of divs. And these are just elements like any other, so we can do things with them. We can access its data set, its first child, it's in a text, it's in a HTML, and you can see actually here, this contains the inner text of 0 and the inner HTML the same. So now we've got that kind of list of cells in here, we can use that to our advantage. Great, so we've created our grid here. What we're going to want to do is we're going to want to add a duck to each of those cells. So I think possibly the easiest way to do this would be to create a rule in our CSS that when there's a specific class on a div, it should have a background image of our little sprite. Now, feel free to go ahead and download the duck image that I've put in the lesson. I have it here already. So I'm just going to drag this across and put it inside my project here. And it's just this little image of a duck. Good practice here would be to have a folder called assets, and then put that duck inside our assets folder. So feel free to go ahead and do that. You can obviously go and download any image that you like from the internet. Great, so in our CSS, let's make a duck class. And what we're going to do is we're going to say when something has the .duck class, it should have a background image, and this will be a URL of // because we're going outside of our styles folder here. And then we're going to go into assets, and then it will be our duck.jpg. So let's now say that we don't want this to repeat. So we want our background image to have, background repeat to have no repeat. And we also want it to be contained within our square. So we'll say background size is contain. Great. So nothing will have changed, of course, on our site because none of our cells have the class of duck. So let's just go into our app.js just to check that this is working as we expect. So in our for loop here, let's add the class of duck to every cell when we create it. So we'll say cell.classList.add, and then parentheses, and what we're going to give it is the class name, a string of that class name of duck. So if we save this now, let's have a look what happens. Brilliant, we get a duck in every single square, and these look exactly as we would expect. It's covering, it's contained all within that cell. Fab. So that's just testing that when we add the duck class to one of our cells, the duck actually appears as we expect it to. Fantastic. We can remove that now because, of course, we don't want a duck in every single cell. So just save that and we can see that they're all removed. Fantastic. So what we really want to do here is we want to add a duck into a random cell. So what I think we should do as an approach is we should write a function that will add the duck to a cell for us. And then in a second function, we should pick which cell it appears in. And I think that this will give us lots of flexibility if, say, in the future, we wanted to add rules to which cell the duck was to appear in. So let's go ahead and up here, we're going to write a function and let's call it add duck. This function will take a position in the future, but let's just for now just write it in its most basic form. So we're starting our code block here, and we'll say in here what we want to do is add the duck class to a cell. First things first, let's just make sure that this add duck will run. So we'll say console.log adding duck. And then underneath our create grid here, because of course we need to create the grid before we add any ducks to it. Otherwise we can run into errors, and we'll maybe see that in a moment as well. So here, what we want to do is we want to call our add duck function. So if we just save that, and in our console, we are getting adding duck. Wonderful. So inside here, inside our add duck function, we want to go into our cells array, and then we want to pick out one of them. So for the moment, let's just try and get a duck to appear in our 0 box. So we'll say our cells at index 0, we want to go into our class list, and then we want to add a class. So we're doing cells at index 0 dot class list dot add, and then we will say we are going to add duck. So if we save this now and we come back, brilliant, we've now added that duck class to our 0 index, our 0 cell. Fantastic. So we know that this works. Now let's get it to work with when a position is provided. So this could be 0, it could be 1, it could be 10, it could be 8, it could be any of our cells. So let's instead pass a position into our function. So we'll say position as our parameter here, and we will pass this position in here. Now when we call the function, let's just add any random number into here. Let's say 8 and save this. Wonderful, our duck appears in cell 8. Let's try number 91 and save that. Wonderful, our duck appears in 91. Wonderful. So what we can do is we can just delete that. We know that that function is now working. Okay, so we've come quite far and we've got quite a lot done here. There's 2 routes that most games take from this point onwards. Either that things appear on the grid, Or you might need to, and they are done with clicking, and clicking is quite easy to do because we click on a cell and we get the event data from that cell. There's also another way that a lot of games go, and that's where you need to move something around the grid. So if you're making something such as like a Space Invaders game, you will need to be able to move your little spaceship along your grid. And you'll need to do that with keyboard or with clicking other buttons. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop this video now. In the next video, we're going to look at keyboard input and how we move things around our grid. And then in a later video, we're then actually going to finish off this game as it's intended with the clicking kind of functions that this game will have. And what this means is that depending on the game that you decide to create, you'll have code available for you to refer back to no matter which sort of input you need to take. So go ahead and look at the next video for keyboard inputs.